Okay. Hello and welcome to the 2021 Duke China-U.S. Summit's Technology Panel. Our panel will discuss topics regarding China's reality and potential as an innovation powerhouse, opportunities and challenges in the current business environment in China and the U.S., with a special focus on the technology industry. I'd like to welcome our moderator for this panel, Dr. Denis Simon. Dr. Denis Simon is the Senior Advisor to the President for China Affairs at Duke and Professor of China Business and Technology at Duke's Fuqua School of Business. Dr. Simon has more than 4 decades of experience studying business, competition, innovation, and technology strategy in China. He will lead our speakers, Ms. Jane Ding, Mr. Paul Triolo, and Mr. Zhengyu Huang during the panel discussion. Next, I will introduce our 3 speakers today. Ms. Jane Ding is the co-founder and CEO of Cloud School Technology, Inc., dedicated to providing digital solutions to corporate education and training. Cloud School has successfully raised its D-round investment of over $3 billion. Mr. Triolo leads the geo-technology practice at Eurasia Group, focusing on global technology policy issues, cybersecurity, internet governance, ICT regulatory issues, and emerging areas such as 5G deployment, automation, artificial intelligence, green tech, and fintech, blockchain, and sovereign digital currencies. Mr. Zhengyu Huang is the chairman of an education-focused investment firm. He worked at Intel Corporation and served under President Obama as a White House Fellow and a Special Assistant to the Administrator for U.S. Agency for International Development after graduating from Stanford University and Harvard Business School. He also started a financial service data firm that grew to 300 staff and 7 offices. We will have a 15-minute Q&A session at the end of the panel. Please feel free to leave questions in the chat. Now, let's welcome our moderator, Dr. Simon.
Good morning, everyone, and good evening to those in China and the rest of Asia. I'm glad you've been able to join us this morning. We have a very exciting panel this morning. I think we're going to get into some very interesting material and hopefully elucidate an up-to-date picture of what's actually going on the ground in China with respect to the technology situation. So we identified about 7 or 8 areas that I'd like to talk about with our panelists, and we're going to go through a discussion-like format. And our panelists can respond to me, they can respond to one another, but we want to keep it very fast-moving and very fluid. And as was said by Yuchi, we're going to take some questions from you for the last 15, 20 minutes or so. So why don't we begin? There's a lot of discussion today about China's business environment. Some people who think it's dramatically improved, and others think that the business environment still faces many, many difficult challenges. Dingjie, as somebody who started a new business and really has been a true entrepreneur, what do you see as the state of the art in China's business environment? Is it as difficult as some say, or if you have the right knowledge and the right guanxi, can you really make things happen?
Thank you, Dr. Simon. I think that is my priority to introduce some business environment in China. So for my idea is that is also depends on which kind of business you want to do. I think the potential market is very huge in China. That is obviously everyone know that. But if we want to start up a company, that means what kind of business? If you still focus on the very traditional business, yes, that is very difficult because all the environment should be changed now. But if you focus on the new technical and also you focus on really customer needs, not just focus on the product, you focus on the customer needs, what they want, because now the customer is change their needs very specification. So the niche market is very important. So if you focus on the niche market, like in China, we have many company is focused on very niche the customer needs, especially that they focus on the customer, such as Douyin is a short video, like the young person very like that. Yeah. So I think totally, I think my idea is if you have really funded the customer needs and you use the very technical the business to solve their problem, that is a still better environment in China. Yes, that is my idea. Thank you.
Okay. Huang Zhengyu, do you see a lot of impediments? The U.S.-China conflicts over many things, but one of the things is that the playing field is not level. That some people say that need is for China now to make the playing field more level so that foreign companies and local companies can compete head on in a fair and reasonable manner. Is that a really a big issue, or is there something else lurking behind it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think how Chinese business environment is perceived really depends on the perspective of the beholder, of the observer. So I can think of immediately three categories. First is foreign-owned enterprises, which you're referring to. And second, private enterprises, perhaps owned by the likes of Jieding here. And then lastly, state-owned enterprises. For foreign-owned enterprises, the market is becoming more and more competitive. We have to know that it was never fair play in the beginning, right? In the 70s, 80s, the foreign-owned enterprises had all the capital, all the technology, all the talents. And now they realize that the Chinese companies are beginning to have the same too. Now the government policies has expounded and exasperated on this. So therefore, I think a lot of foreign companies feel like it's not fair because the advantages that they used to enjoy are no more, yet they face similar restrictions as from the past. The second category are the private-owned enterprises. I started a company in China. I have to say, extremely competitive. It's an extremely competitive environment in any space you're in as a private enterprise. And yet there's a lot of room to grow, a lot of room to flourish until you get to a big size. And then you will probably inevitably butt against the next category, which are state-owned enterprises. And in state-owned enterprises, it is clear to everyone that they have great market power. It's just absolutely clear they have great market power, but their effectiveness and efficiency, that's the part that's yet unclear to a lot of people.
Great. Paul, you work with a lot of multinational companies, and Eurasia Group serves in capacity as advisor, consultant, etc. When you listen to the stories coming back from these multinationals, what are the big issues that they're really concerned about today? And we all know, again, China is a fluid environment. So what was important, even 2-3 years ago may have changed. So can you give us an up-to-date sense of where the real concerns of foreign business lie today as you look at the landscape in China?
Wow, big question, Dennis. And again, thanks for having me on here. I would agree with Huang that Mr. Huang that this it sort of depends on where you're sitting here. I mean, obviously, U.S. companies, for example, in the retail space, see China as continue to see China as a huge market and are doing very well. Companies like Walmart, Procter & Gamble, those kind of companies. So it's really dependent on the sector. The other areas where companies remain concerned about doing business in China, of course, are some of the issues that came up in the U.S.-China trade negotiations in the Trump era, where the issues around market access, of course, were huge. And those are obviously again, sort of sector dependent. I mean, the financial sector in particular, where there has been some opening recently, of course, in the Chinese market, but other areas like technology, things like cloud services, for example, became a huge issue in the trade talks. There was a bit of progress made, but that's the kind of thing that once the Biden administration hopefully gets back to looking at things that were pushed, for example, to the phase 2 negotiations, those kinds of areas can be looked at, because again, the U.S. companies are many of our clients are interested in the technologies of the future, and cloud services is a particularly big one where there's a feeling that there's not reciprocity, and that there are areas there where the Chinese market could be further open. But then, and if you look at areas like semiconductors, which we end up looking a lot at, a lot of our clients are in the semiconductor space. China U.S. companies are doing very well in that space, because many Chinese companies are relying on U.S. semiconductors. And so that's an area where some of the U.S. government policies have had major implications, which we can talk about. And that's something that I think there's still a lot of concern among U.S. companies that the U.S. will restrict further exports to China in that arena. And that's become a very big center of sort of geopolitical stress. But I think, let me just step back finally and just note something broadly, which is I think there's a lot of concern also about sort of the maturity in China around things like financial markets. And so I think this is going to become a big issue under the Biden administration, which is, Chinese companies going public, but not adhering, for example, to U.S. auditing rules. And this sort of goes back to a lot of uncertainty about sort of ownership structures in China around companies, who owns them. There's not a lot of transparency here. And I think this is going to be a big issue going forward, both in large part for Chinese companies that want to go public in the U.S., of which there's still quite a bit of interest in that, but also just how investors think about investing and in the China market in companies and in stocks, in the growing Chinese financial sector, capital markets. I'm the STAR market in Shanghai, for example, which I think Xi Jinping mentioned. The 14th Five-Year Plan mentioned as a prominent sort of vehicle for Chinese companies to go public, and the STAR has become sort of a big focal point for that. So I think issues around sort of the maturity of the financial sector and where China goes from here in terms of developing a more transparent and sort of open system around publicly accounting for company company strength and company financial capabilities is really going to be a huge issue going forward, and will affect the domestic market also.
Great, thank you. Let's go a little bit to the area of the changing face of the Chinese market. I recently was reading an article by McKinsey about the after effects of COVID on the Chinese market. And one of the arguments they're making is that there were trends towards digitalization and Bitcoin and cashless economy already underway in China as COVID hit the Chinese mainland. And then over the last year, those trends have been accelerated, perhaps to the advantage of China. Dingjie, do you see digitalization really gaining hold in China, and that we really are going to be in a truly cashless economy in China just in the next few years ahead?
That is a very good question, Dr. Simon. And I think for my idea is I fully agree that McKinsey their idea, because I think the Chinese all the China business now we start a new situation is we call Internet Plus. So that means we need to use the new technical to change the potential business and a traditional business. Yeah. So I think for my idea is if we have I just focus on the customer needs. Yes. Then I should to penetration to the internet, and through the new technical and fund the I think is a very new market, new potential market in China. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay. Zhengyu, do you have a sense of some of this digital spread in the Chinese marketplace? I know that before I left in June of 2020, we were talking to a lot of companies, and their interest is how to prepare for the new digitalization proliferation that was about to occur, including foreign and domestic companies. How do you see that landscape evolving?
Yeah, I think, COVID has shown a massive shift to digitization of our economy, not just in China, but in the US as well, right? I think the area I'm more interested about China is not on the consumer side, because I think the consumer side has always been very adaptive and very advanced. It's really on the corporate side. That shift on the corporate side in China, I think actually has been slower than expected, right? You've seen, American companies adapting, I think very fervently towards digitization, cloud computing, et cetera, distributed work. And I think we're beginning to see that on the corporate side in China as well, especially due to COVID. So I think that's the more interesting and worth watching part, because ultimately that's going to unleash a lot of efficiency, a lot of productivity, and a lot of market opportunities. I do want to circle back and address one point that Paul made, which I've been thinking about quite a bit, which is around this concept of reciprocity. Especially in the last few years, we heard this word a lot, right? Which means if I do something for you, if I open my market to you, you should do the same to me, right? Which in theory sounds perfect, right? It should be it. I mean, any relationship, you should have reciprocity. But if we think about it, China does have a different system, right? It's a system where state-owned enterprises actually play a dominant role, not just in terms of guaranteeing jobs, but really as a lever for the government to kind of manage the economy. And so for the Chinese government to do away for support or even direct control of state enterprises, I find that to be very difficult. And so in the case of having different systems fundamentally, perhaps reciprocity could be better imagined as mutual accountability. Meaning if I promise you to do something, I will do it. And I will keep or have myself be held accountable, right, on both sides. So I think that's the interesting, conversation in the next iteration with this current administration. Will they move from the idea of reciprocity, meaning if I do something, you should do it just like me, to this idea of, okay, I admit that we have different systems. Let's be mutually accountable to each other, because we can still make sure that if you promise something, you execute to it.
Sure. I think that's a great point. Paul, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I think that's a great issue. I think one of the problems with the way the U.S. approached, for example, the trade negotiations and things like cloud services and data governance was, there wasn't sufficient recognition that these are two different systems. China's, for example, data governance system is evolving at a different pace than China's, and so those discussions need to take place, with a lot of nuance. And for example, under the previous discussions, the really heavy trade negotiations, when they got the cloud services, they realized pretty quickly that this was beyond almost just the issue of cloud services. It got into data governance and how do you manage data privacy and data protection and other things. And so I think when the U.S. chooses to re-engage with China, which I hope it will do, based on last week's Alaska a kickoff that was that not very auspicious, but I think there are those in the Biden administration that want to seriously engage China on these issues, and that has to be done in a spirit of recognizing the differences and working towards some level of accountability. I like the way that's put. But these have to get back to really serious negotiations, which was the shining point really of the Trump era in terms of U.S.-China interaction. Right, everything else was very low-level bilateral engagement, but the trade issue was taken very seriously. It's just that it was in a very difficult, taking place in a very difficult environment. Let me say something just quickly about the digital question which you raised earlier. I think that's a great way to look at it, which is that consumer side has been cashless for a long time with all the with WeChat Pay and Alipay. The other issue there is the sovereign digital currency issue, which is complicated, and a lot of issues going around there on cross-border transactions. But I agree that the B2B stuff is really in the corporate situation is really where the action is going to be, particularly moving to the cloud. This is a big emphasis in the 14th Five-Year Plan and in the new infrastructure initiative that was rolled out last May. And if you look at the details in the 14th Five-Year Plan, it's really, there's a lot of emphasis on advanced manufacturing and really beefing up the manufacturing sector in China, and that means going to things like the cloud and automation. And of course, China has a lot of advantages there with 5G rollouts being in sort of full swing. The next stage of 5G will be sort of mobile edge computing, which really means pushing data centers out towards factories, smart factories, and that kind of thing. But that's going to be that process is going to take time. But clearly, China has a big advantage in some sense on the U.S. in terms of rolling out that infrastructure, because the U.S. is pretty far behind in terms of just overall 5G, let alone getting that sort of smart factory infrastructure in place. So I think that's going to be really where the action is in the coming 2 years.
Great.
Okay, Dr. Simon, I have also idea is fully agree is in China to the consumer market and the clouding, how to change that, and especially mobile internet in China is more popular. Yes, so but to the B2B business, to business, we call business internet, still like with China, still not very strong. So that is a good opportunity for some company if they do the business clouding and the business international like that. And another idea is I don't think in China we more focus on some political relationship. Yeah, we just focus on the market. Yeah, because I think something we cannot change. But if we do the good business, really to suitable the customer needs, that is more important for us to do the business in China. Yeah.
Well,
thank you.
That's the really good point, but I don't want to be overly provocative. But if we had Mr. Jack Ma here on our panel and we asked him to respond, he might not agree these days. Recently, Zhengyu's point about the Guoyuan about the state-owned enterprises is a very good one. But we've also seen the face of that economy change. The role of the so-called private sector and the growth of companies like Tencent and Baidu and Ant, Alibaba, etc., have really changed the landscape. But we now seem to be going through a process where the leadership is reconsidering the amount of influence that these companies are developing. And I'm wondering if any of you would like to comment. Do you see really a rethink going on, or something else happening that might explain, for example, some of the rough waters that Ant experienced when it went to go to market, for its next iteration? Anybody want to make a remark here? Because I think this is an important development in order to understand where China may be headed. Paul, how about you first?
Sure. Yeah, this is a complicated issue. We've done a lot of work on this because we have a lot of clients who are very interested in the state. We're big investors in Ant, of course, and we're very concerned with that issue. I think what happened, of course, is a complicated story here. I mean, basically, the big tech platforms like Tencent and Alibaba they were in an environment early on where they were not regulated, and so they got into all of these other businesses, particularly on the financial side. And the PBOC, for example, has never been that comfortable with the expansion of these big tech players to dominate these major states like payments, as we talked about. Think of it as the central bank has a lot of concern here about financial stability, and if a huge part of your consumer payments infrastructure is in private hands, that's a huge issue. So I think you have to see the Jack, and of course Jack himself is unusual and managed to piss off a lot of people with the Bund speech, but I think that came at a time when there was already a lot of concern about Ant, and there was a lot of speculation in the stock. For example, everybody was leveraging themselves up to very, very heavily to get in on that IPO. So the whole thing generated a lot of angst. And then, of course, I think it went all the way up to Xi Jinping himself, who pulled the plug. But I think it's representative of a much broader issue. And we've seen already since then, the regulators are in China, the financial system regulators are very mature, the PBOC in particular. And so they're trying to figure out a way to get those big platforms to de-risk, if you will, their businesses, and so get them out of certain financial sectors, and also to sort of try to break up this duopoly, this Tencent Alibaba duopoly. And so you saw just even this week where Alibaba is going to allow Tencent, Tencent on WeChat. There's going to be some, they're trying to break up that sort of that's an antitrust issue. So there's a lot of things going on here. There's sort of antitrust. There's also just financial regulation, where again these guys got too big, and I think there was a lot of concern in the system over sort of systemic risk. But I don't think the regulators want to, kill Ant or Alibaba or Tencent. These are national champions, so they're trying to toe this very careful line, but to sort of recontrol and re-regulate them, but do it in a way that allows them to continue to being, such dominant key players in the digital economy in China. But the 14th Five-Year Plan definitely reflected less emphasis on big platform and tech and e-commerce, and more on sort of traditional manufacturing and the traditional economy. So I think that was also an interesting change in tone.
Zhengyu, if you take the discussions that have been going on about Microsoft, Amazon, etc., back in Washington, not only during the Trump administration, but even before that, there were concerns about similar kinds of antitrust. Is the Chinese system facing the same dilemmas that the American system has been facing with respect to the power and concentration of just a few companies who have a dramatic control over things in a way that, as Paul indicated, makes some people uneasy at the very least?
Yeah, Dennis, I think you're right on point. In my personal opinion, I think this is the opening salvo of a monumental struggle, the likes of which we haven't seen since Teddy Roosevelt and the anti-trust regulations against Standard Oil. And what I mean by this is the 2020 elections vividly show how incredibly powerful big tech could be to influence the contours of government, right? And various, protests, unrest, etc., around the world has seen the incredible power of big tech to influence not just the daily activities of consumers, but this is the first time I think many countries realize to influence the contours of government. So I think this, I don't want to use the word struggle, but really this confrontation between big tech and big government, I think will be played out globally. I think China is trying to tackle this their own unique way. I don't think their recipe will be able to be duplicated around the world, but I think the world will be watching, because they are in effect saying it's government first and tech second, and tech is in subservience to the government, and this is how we will allow tech to play and flourish. Again, whether that will work or not, I don't know. Just like whether the current administration, if they look at antitrust action towards Google or Amazon or Facebook, etc., whether that will work, I don't know. But this is one of those, I think that if we look back decades from now, this is one of those monumental confrontations, because this is all about who has influence over consumers, but also more of who has influence towards the government of the people.
Okay. Great comments. Yeah. Let me just quickly add, I think that, in the US, it's tricky because there's also an argument that those big platforms make, for example, which may not hold as much water now, that if they're regulated or broken up, or their sort of power is reduced, that the Chinese companies will then, who are not regulated. That was an argument that Zuckerberg was making last year. So I think I agree, this is a really critical year. We almost had one of our top risks. Every year we do top 10 risks, and I advocated for big tech, big bang as a top risk, and I was sort of shot down because people within the company were thinking, well, yeah, there's a lot of regulatory pressure building in the US against the tech platforms, but maybe 2021, because of the pandemic and all the other issues that the US is dealing with, for example, won't be that big of an issue. But of course, then China has ended up being where there's been sort of a big tech, big bang thing, and with all the regulatory issues swirling around
Yeah, sorry for interruption. I think we need to get into the conversation talking about economic situation. And I think that everybody have a so strong interest about the China, a big tech company, how they grow. And thank you for the pay such big attention on this. Actually, doesn't matter it is the like big tech company or startup company. We need talking about what's the business purpose of this business model. And let's move back to the foundation of what we discuss here, which is how the innovation company can grow the business model and grow the economic. So I know we have such long list talking about recently what happened in the political side, but I heavily encourage the professor here or the colleague here move back to our original topic, which is talking about the innovation and technology, how this can help us to grow the business. Thank you.
Okay. Good suggestion. And in fact, that's where I was headed as we start to look at all of this. Part of the reason we're so interested, obviously, is because of the question that is the big question right now on the agenda of everyone, and that is China on its way to becoming some kind of innovation powerhouse? We saw it in the 14th five-year plan that the R&D spending is continuing to grow over 7% per year. That today China accounts for over 23% of global R&D spending, which makes it the second largest R&D spender in the world. And perhaps within 5 years, by the end of that 14th five-year plan, it may in fact become the #1 spender and reach somewhere about 2.7, 2.8 of GDP in terms of its overall R&D spending. Now, we know money doesn't always buy innovation, but the reality is that this big addition of resources, it seems to make a difference. Paul, from a macro, you deal with geopolitical and geotechnical issues. Is there really a fear that China is going to become some kind of juggernaut, unstoppable, and become so dominant that we're not going to know what hit us? I was listening to Bill Maher the other night, and Bill Maher had a commentary. He's a U.S. political commentator, in which he said, the game is over already. China already has eaten our lunch, which is, of course, some hyperbole, but nonetheless, I think that this kind of speaks to the environment in which we're operating about Chinese innovation. China was an innovation laggard, and then we seem to have woken up, and all of a sudden it's an innovation, juggernaut. So I wonder what your thoughts about this are.
Yeah, I think the memes, about this are very far off. And again, it depends on what sector you're talking about. When it comes to something like artificial intelligence, the Chinese companies are very capable in many aspects of that. For example, facial recognition, natural language processing. You've had the rise of really incredible Chinese companies like iFlyTech and Megvii that are world-class companies and are innovating. And the Chinese education system, for example, produces a lot of really good software engineers who go into those companies and do really well. I have a good friend who's a CEO of one of the small startup companies in Shenzhen that's in the AI space. And he tells me all the time how he's amazed that even the second and third tier universities in China produce really good engineers and software engineers. And there's a huge competition among all the big companies, including the big players like Alibaba and Tencent, for these AI software engineers who can come into these companies and help them innovate. So in that kind of space, there's a tremendous amount of innovation in China, and China's very competitive. A lot of that is focused on business operations and AI optimization. The US is kind of focused on AI more broadly, and I think they're thinking in terms of, I don't know, military uses of AI, other things, where again, China isn't really focusing on. All the action in China is on things like consumer applications of AI or medical applications of AI, for example, recognizing tumors. I know a lot of people in that sphere. But then when you step back and look at something like the semiconductor industry, again, there the issue is not so much is China gonna out innovate the US. It's a concern about things like subsidies and that area. And again, China is really good. Chinese companies are very good in certain areas of semiconductors, like design, for example. I mean, Huawei's design arm, HiSilicon, is a world-class innovative company. They're designing chips on par with Qualcomm and NVIDIA. but then in other areas, you know, of the semiconductor space, China's way behind the West. For example, in semiconductor manufacturing equipment, that, you know, Chinese companies are probably 5 to 7 years behind the U.S. So the U.S. meme, as you rightly point out, has sort of been, you know, from China couldn't innovate to now China is, you know, is 800 feet tall and is going to dominate some of these sectors. And it's just not a very accurate picture. I think things like Made in China 2025 and things like the National IC Investment Fund and the National AI Strategy sort of, you know, these are aspirational strategies, but they have sort of freaked people out. And you see, I think, fairly wrong lenses being applied to Chinese tech sectors, sort of coming through a U.S., you know, long-term concern, but each issue is each sector is very different in terms of where China is and how innovative China is.
Dingjie, you know, on the ground in China, you are hiring people, you're trying to find qualified engineers and other kinds of people. How easy is it to find the kind of talent that you need to drive your business and also hopefully to be innovative in terms of the things that you're doing and the things that you can offer your clients?
I thank you for this question, and I think I like to answer the question before I answer this question. Ahead of what we're talking. Firstly, I need to see. I understand after the pandemic. The U.S. friend get most of the news from the newspaper and the public information, and I heard so glad to hear you start to study of what's the governance planning ahead for us. But actually, at the same time, we need to see at the ground here. The innovation is not only from top down, from the planning, from the governance, but also from the reality, how on the ground of the innovative company and the older tech company, what they do day by day, and based on the the market here. So your question talk about how we find the talent for the AI and the technology. Definitely it is quite the high competition about talent at the current moment, especially for the AI and such type of the technology. And definitely it is always the challenge for the company to find out the best talent. So definitely from the talent strategy, we do have the three intention. Definitely we will hire the new blood graduate, university graduate to grow from the company we think, so we can grow them, to educate them. At the same time, we collaborate with the other partner who already have the technology ahead, so we could collaborate to development the product. We could collaborate. And also from the investment world, we can do the from financial perspective, we could from the merge and acquisition, we can also have the talent from the other side of the company, which is we can work together. I hope this could already answer your question.
Well, let me just ask very simply, can you find the talent that you need? There's a lot of discussion about the Chinese education system not yet able to produce and meet the needs of employers, that too much memorization, too much repeat from Gaokao, and not enough critical thinking, not enough free and open thinking. Are you finding people that helping you, really become the innovative company that obviously you'd like to become?
Actually, this is the situation everywhere, not only China, but I think it is the same in U.S. No company U.S. can claim they could find enough talent in the market, and I think it is the same in China as well. So the system, the education system in different sides, that definitely has the different. But from the talent growth perspective, this is the big issue across every country, every company.
Good. Okay, let me switch gears a little bit, and let's talk a little bit about Chinese investment in technology in the United States. And this is something, Zhengyu, I think that you have some knowledge of and experience with. can you give me a sense of, what is it that Chinese investors are looking for when they look at the U.S. market, and particularly in terms of access to technology? The Trump administration became extremely, concerned about this, that somehow that China was stealing the crown jewels or whatever. But from a business point of view, strictly a strategic business aim, what are these Chinese companies trying to seek out? Are they like the Japanese companies of the 80s who came, looking for markets and et cetera, or is there something different on their agenda?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dennis. I could give you a very long-winded answer, probably 2 years ago.
We only have about 4 minutes before we have to go into Q&A. So
exactly. So I can actually give you a very short answer now, given that it's 2 years since, which is nothing much is happening. All of that is on ice. Everybody I knew who used to make investments in China, in the United States with Chinese equity, I mean, a lot of that has stopped. Even on the venture capital side, I think that's petered out extremely. I mean, before there was tremendous amount of M&A activities. I think that, to my knowledge, most of that has kind of stopped. But even during the worst of times, people thought, venture capital, when you're investing 5% or less, could still proceed accordingly. But I think I've seen also a significant slowdown there as well. So this question, I think, will, again, as much as entrepreneurs like to believe that they can thrive in any environment, today, when it comes to U.S.-China cross-border activities, it is very much impacted by the decisions made in Beijing and D.C.
Paul, you want to comment on this? It's also probably part of a kind of risk assessment profile that both Chinese companies and American companies have to think about as they now, consider the next stage post-COVID of what they're going to be doing in each other's countries.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously just in the last, particularly the last 2 years of the Trump administration, the investment climate in the U.S. has become increasingly hostile to Chinese companies across the board. And I think, part of that is also the sort of beefing up of the Committee for Foreign Investment in the U.S., CFIUS, as part of the overall sort of upgrading of the U.S. Foreign Investment Review and Export Control System in 2018 with the passage of some new legislation. And so, CFIUS got 70 new officers there who are well-versed in venture capital and technology issues, and they're combing through lots of deals that may involve Chinese investors or Chinese, principals to some degree. And they've of course rolled back a lot of investments, including deals that were already done, like last year, like Grindr, Patients Like Me. And so I think we're going to see a continuing tough environment in the U.S. for Chinese investment, because there's also going to be, under the Biden team, for example, an upgrading of or looking at which technologies to control, further emerging technologies and foundational technologies that were called for in this legislation. And so I think it's going to be tough, for example, for a Chinese company to invest in anything related to AI, quantum computing, things, even things like semiconductors. I think there are areas like autonomous vehicles, for example, where there may be some little more leeway that hasn't been focused on. But it's going to be pretty tough because a lot of these technologies are linked, and there's sort of a, there's an infrastructure now in DC that's saying, hey, we got to be careful about who we're going to let invest in these startups in the Valley, for example, in these emerging technologies.
Okay, why don't we move to some of our audience questions now? We have one interesting question about the aging of the Chinese population. With the aging occurring and the fact that the elderly people are now growing faster as a group than the young people, how is that going to affect the Chinese innovation potential? Is China going to hit a brick wall of some sort in terms of having enough young people with the right skills to be able to support a China as so-called innovation nation? Anyone want to take that on? Zhengyu?
Well, a couple of things. One is, I think anybody who's been to China knows that, when Chinese people retire, they become kind of nannies for their grandkids. right? The Chinese elders are not standing still and not doing anything. There's actually tremendous, I think, economic productivity and value that's performed by older Chinese people that are not being captured. So there, I think there's tremendous value. Of course, the concomitant issue is healthcare, because I think the Chinese government realizes that the healthcare system today is insufficiently prepared for an aging population. I think there we're hoping to see a lot more transformation, a lot more opportunities, and a lot more innovation. Now, in terms of not having enough younger people, there's principally a couple of issues, right? The first is, will you have enough young people to support the old people? For example, in the United States, this is a huge issue because Social Security is supported by young people paying for old people. In China, there isn't as big of a black hole for older folks relying on Social Security. So it's not as pressing an issue as actually in the United States. However, when you talk about innovation, I think innovation comes in two parts. One is absolute numbers, quality, and then the other is quantity, right? I'm sorry, the absolute numbers, which is quantity, and then it's quality. In terms of quantity, just because the base is so big in China, that even with perhaps lower number of young people by proportion, it's still a lot in absolute numbers. I mean, it's still a lot of engineers, a lot of technologists, etc. I think China needs to continue to work on improving the quality, right, of its workforce. If you can look how many Elon Musks do you need in your industry, right? How many Steve Jobs? Like, you get 5 or 10 of these, they'll change the world, right? So for China, it's not just the quantity; they really have to work on the quality. And I think if they continue to get again, I don't know if we put Jack Ma on that same level, just because so much of what we see in Chinese innovation has been around business model innovation rather than actual more fundamental product innovation, etc. But I think in the coming decades, we're going to see people like Steve Jobs, like Elon Musk in China, and if those folks have the room to play and innovate and change. That's going to be incredible. That's, I think, where China is going to be really taking a leap forward, because they'll have the quantity. I think they'll have the number of highly educated, engineers who, once they have the right, leaders, could really make a difference.
So we have a kind of follow-up question for Ding Jie, and that is that do you find yourself competing with multinational companies for high-end talent? When you do, are you losing to the international companies, or is there, as Zhengyu has suggested, a big enough pool that everyone can have a good engineer if they want one?
That is really an interesting question, because I worked for a multinational company before, and definitely at that role, I did find the competition has the both international background as well as understand China market. It is quite a big competition across multinational company. And right now I'm taking the domestic company role, and I find out actually it is ignore the how to say the background of the geography. Most of the talent actually we find out is know more about the China, and definitely I have experience in my current company. I have a foreigner who applied for my current company, and he's pretty good at technology side. So we also offer him a job to do the technology developer. So I find out when we recruit with the different background people, that bring the diversity to the organization. So I do appreciate from culture perspective. Right now, our company actually is more focused on domestic China business, which is, I think, most of the Chinese talent could affordable for this opportunity. But maybe someday my company will beyond the current scope, which is we want to expand our business to other country. I think at that time, I also need more international experience and background people. And at that time, maybe I think that's the new wave of the talent competition.
Okay, great, great. Okay, we have two other questions. One, and both, I'll start with Paul. One is about space technology. China has done some remarkable things in space. There's a plan to put a research center of some sort on the moon. Anything to say about where China is, going to go in space, and what does that mean for the United States and for Russia, etc.?
Well, yeah, this is space. We didn't even talk about this. Space is an area where clearly China has really good space launch capabilities. For a long time, they're very competitive. They put up a GPS system, Beidou, which has both civilian and military applications, but is also very competitive as an alternative. So yeah, we forget in these areas where China has huge and long developed capabilities that make it a player. And then you extend that into space exploration. This is a tricky one. It's sort of a combination of scientific endeavor and a little bit of vanity, we have to admit. But yeah, I mean, I think China is going to the moon has become a new sort of target for space programs. And then of course, in the U.S., what's happened, a lot of the space activity has moved to the private sector. We haven't seen that in China, but you have Elon with his SpaceX and doing a launch just about every day for his endeavors like Starlink, and then his mission to Mars, which he's developing a heavy lift capacity for. So there's a bit of competition in space that's going on. I think the U.S. Has always been concerned about China, more from a military point of view, of course, and things like satellites and anti-satellite warfare, which became an issue 4 or 5 years ago. So I think that's an area where, again, there could be some more collaboration. Probably the two sides should talk about those kinds of issues and concern about things in space where it's a complicated area, and there needs to be dialogue. So I'm very much hoping that's a good example of one of these many issues that two countries have to talk about to avoid inadvertent conflict over things like space. So it's a big area, I think, going forward for the Biden team.
Okay. Our last question is a big question. It's a big macro question, but it has a lot of implications. When you look at the 1980s and the normalization of relations between the U.S. and China, one of the goals of the United States was to bring China into the mainstream of global economic, political, education, science and technology affairs, etc. And for much of the last 40 years, we've done that. But in the recent speeches around the 14th five-year plan, we see a return of the term 自力更生, or self-reliance. This self-reliance is different than 自主创新, indigenous innovation. Do you think that this push for self-reliance is being driven from internal factors in China, or do you think is that China is being backed into a corner somewhat, and that the West, probably counter to its goal of bringing China in, is now pushing China back? And I'd wonder if Zhengyu, you'd like to comment, and maybe Paul as a final comment.
Sure. I like to answer this question in a slightly different way. I think today, because of the pandemic, the world is awash in liquidity, right, in printed money. But I think the world is very short on another currency, which is trust. And the pandemic has really exposed fundamentally the lack of trust, not just between US and China, but really around the world. See how uncoordinated we've been as a species in responding to COVID, and see how completely uncoordinated we are again in the distribution of vaccines. Right now, any country, I don't think it's just China, any country under such scenario will likely say, you know what, I got to take care of myself first, right? And so in the United States, we see us saying, hey, let's bring our supply chain back, right? In Europe, we hear that as well. And so China, I think, is actually one of many cases that will be re-examining, its place in the global system. And I think the global system, again, I go back to this one very important currency, hard to measure, but incredibly important, perhaps fundamental to any human relation, which is trust. How do we rebuild trust amongst countries, and in particular between US and China?
Great. Paul, last comment on this. We have
I totally
2
agree.
minutes.
Yeah, I can. Well, look, I think that the language of the at the NPC and the 45-year plan was pretty clear. There's a reemphasis on domestic revitalization and the dual circulation, but it's happening in what China considers a more hostile international environment. And so I think it's clear that Xi and the Chinese leadership is reacting to sort of the moves in the US and also in Europe, and this idea that like-minded democracies might get together and try to contain China in the technology domain. So I think I am worried that we're pushing China into a corner, and I think that's again a bad thing. I think the trust issue is paramount. So I think that I've been a bit critical of the Biden team so far, because I think I would like to see some really new thinking on China and how to avoid pushing China away and not reestablishing that dynamic that you mentioned of bringing China, making sure that China feels it's a part of the international rules-based order, and which it has benefited so much from, and not really leading to sort of a decoupled or bifurcated systems, whether it's technology or economic issues. So I think we're at sort of an important crossroads here to see which direction that dynamic takes, and I would like to see it return to some more nuanced level of interaction that helps to rebuild that trust, because I think that's a really critical point. We've had 4 years of digging a hole, and you got to dig a hole back up. You got to fill that hole in to get to it back to trust before you can build on top of that.
Well, good. That's a great point on which to end our session. I want to thank the 3 panelists for some great insights into the Chinese technology environment and what's going on in terms of China business. I think we learned a lot from everyone. If I didn't get to your question, we'll try to answer it through the emails. I'm sorry if we just didn't have enough time, but we have to move on to our next session. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ding Jie, and thank you, Zhengyu, for a wonderful session. And now we'll turn it over to the program coordinators to take us into the next session. Have a great morning, everyone.
Thank you, Dennis, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Dr. Simon.
Everyone, please stay for a moment. We will take a screenshot of our panel. Okay. Can everyone turn on their video? Okay. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for the wonderful discussion. Now, please join us for the closing remark that will be given by Ada and Yada.
Yeah. Thank you to all the panelists for the inspiring discussion. And this concludes the China-U.S. Summit 2021. I hope everyone here has enjoyed the conversations and obtained a more in-depth understanding of China-U.S. relations. I'm Ada Ye, co-president of the organizing committee of the China-U.S. Summit 2021. Yada, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm Wang Yinghe. I'm also a co-president at the DC-US team. And even though this is the end of our main summit agenda, our event hasn't fully ended yet. We'll be hosting a networking session on Remo, and we've already sent out email invitations to the first 100 RSVPs. So many of our distinguished guests who have spoken in the panels will be joining in our networking session. So if you didn't get your question answered, this will be your perfect chance. And the DC-US team will also be there. So if you're interested in joining the DC-US organizing committee for the next year, this will be also a great chance for you to talk with us. But before we go, please join me in giving a good round of applause for the committee members who have been working behind the scenes. It is with their extraordinary drive and commitment in the past year that the summit can grow to this scale. They are Ada Ye, Cao Yuchen, 周轩宇、何婉莹、王美璇、哈尼黄、Glia Kadyrova、刘笑、刘星辰、谢之多、Jeffrey Zheng、Darvin Bora、Iselina Shan、Crystal Zhu、唐文静、冯光宇、徐新宇、王怡康、高子健、Mia Mingsan、周辉英、Vera 金、May Tongtong、Mandy Mu、Carlos 华、陈冠甫、徐雨琪、邹嘉诚、魏子豪、徐雅迪 and Henry Stevens.
Thank you all so much for the work you have done for Duke China-U.S. Summit. Organizing the summit involves a great amount of effort. And here, I want to also say thank you to all of our partners for the summit, who offer great help to the organizing process. They are Duke Cultural Engagement Fund, Duke University Center Activities and Events, Duke Kunshan University, Duke Chinese Student Association, Duke Chinese Student and Scholar Association, the China Market Research Group, Panel Pass, Jean's Kitchen, IPV, Duke Fuqua School of Business, Duke Sanford School of Public Policy, Duke Asian Pacific Studies Institute, Duke Center for Innovation and Entrepreneurship, Duke Global Health Institute, Duke Department of Statistical Science, Duke Department of Computer Science, Duke Asian Student Association, Duke Impact Investing Group, Duke Economic Student Union, Duke Statistical Science Majors Union, Duke International Association, Duke Student Founders Program, Duke Technology Scholars, Duke Kunshan Office of Development and Alumni Relations, Dr. Kang Liu, Dr. David Ridley, and Mrs. Kate Miller. And this concludes the closing remark of Duke China-U.S. Summit 2021. We'll hopefully see you again in Remo. And to people who are part of the 2021 DC-US Organizing Committee, please stay here for a while. We'll be taking a screenshot of all our committee members.
My committee member, I'm the faculty advisor.
Yes.
You're also
You
welcome
can stay
to
too. Yeah.
You have to stay here as well.
Okay. What happened to the education panel? Where did that go?
It was today morning, China Standard Time, where